The invitation never came, but winter arrived anyway, quiet, patient, and unforgiving. It was the season that returned what had been hidden, pressing truth to the surface through snow and silence. Frapst in base of foring bord de Fren. I am a father living alone in a weathered house at the edge of a small town, where winters linger and people speak. My son grew up here, learned to walk across these floors, and then slowly drifted away into a life I was no longer invited to witness. When his wedding passed without my name, I told myself absence was easier than confrontation, but winter had other plans. The morning didn't announce itself, no sudden light, no sound. Just a pale gray sky pressing softly against the windows like it didn't want to wake me either. The kettle sat cold on the stove. I hadn't turned it on yet. I stood there a moment longer than necessary, listening to the house breathe. The old walls creaked once, settling. Even they seemed unsure what kind of day this was supposed to be. Outside, snow drifted down in thin, patient flakes, not enough to cover anything, just enough to soften the edges. Today was my son's wedding day. I knew that much. Everything else felt unspoken. I pulled on my coat and stepped onto the porch. The loose step caught my heel, like it always did. I'd been meaning to fix it for years. Today felt like a good excuse. I fetched the hammer from the shed. The metal was cold, biting through my glove. The board creaked as I knelt, the sound louder than it should have been in the quiet. Snow settled on my shoulders, melting slowly into the fabric. I didn't brush it away. I told myself I was just fixing a step, just another Saturday morning. Just a man with a small job and no plans after. The nails bent the first time. I pulled them out carefully, laid them on the porch rail. My hands moved slow, deliberate. If I kept them busy, maybe my thoughts would stay where I put them, across the street, Mrs. Hanley's curtains shifted. She'd lived there since before my son was born. And she used to bring cookies over when he scraped his knees. The curtain fell back into place. No wave. No knock later, a car passed at the end of the street, tires whispering against the wet road. I watched it disappear, then bent back to the step. The snow made everything quieter than it should have been. Like the town had agreed to keep its voice down, I wondered who was tying their tie right now. Who was adjusting a veil, who was practicing smiles in a mirror. I didn't picture my son, not yet. That felt like touching something hot. By mid-morning, the step sat firm beneath my weight. I tested it twice. It didn't move. I leaned against the porch post, breathing in the smell of damp wood and iron. The sky hadn't changed, still that same washed-out gray. That's when I heard it faint, almost late. The church bells. They drifted across town slowly, like they had a long way to travel. Not joyful, not sharp. Just present. I straightened without realizing it. My hands dropped to my sides, one bell, then another, and I counted them without meaning to. My breath caught somewhere between the third and fourth. I hadn't heard those bells in years, not since my wife's funeral. Back then, they rang heavier. Like they knew what they were doing. These bells sounded different, uncertain, as if they were ringing out of habit, not celebration. I imagined the doors opening, people turning in their seats. Someone whispering, "Here he comes," but it wasn't me. It had never been me. The bells kept going. Each note floated, then faded into the snow. I stood there, alone in my yard, listening like someone waiting for their name to be called in a room they weren't allowed to enter. The last bell rang longer than the rest. It trembled, then fell quiet. And just like that, the town returned to its careful hush. I didn't move right away. And I kept my eyes on the church steeple, barely visible beyond the trees. Brenniketter Converkand. Somewhere between those bells, a decision had been made, not today, long before. I tried to remember the last normal conversation I'd had with my son, not a check-in, not a polite update. A real one. The memory didn't come. I went inside and poured myself coffee, even though I wasn't thirsty. The mug warmed my hands, the steam fogged my glasses. I sat at the table facing the window. The chair across from me stayed empty. The snow picked up a little, flakes drifting sideways now. The road disappeared under white lines that erased where people had been. I thought about driving past the church. Just once, just to see the cars. The thought settled in my chest and stayed there, heavy. I didn't mime hers. Heavy. I didn't move. And around noon, footsteps passed outside, two voices, laughter, careful and brief. They slowed near my gate, then sped up. Necken. I watched the shadows cross the frosted glass. They never knocked. I wondered what people said when they asked where I was. If anyone asked at all, he couldn't make it. It's complicated, he's difficult. I knew how stories changed when someone wasn't there to correct them. The afternoon blurred, light shifted, snow kept falling. I went back out onto the porch and stood on the fixed step. It held me without complaint. The yard looked smaller under snow contanned. Cal Spurken. Somewhere my son was standing at the front of a room, hands folded, waiting. Or maybe he was already past that part. I tried to imagine his face, whether he was calm, or whether he noticed the empty space where I should have been. The thought made my throat tighten. I swallowed and looked away. By the time the sky darkened, the bells were just a memory. Like they'd never rung at all. The porch light flickered on automatically, a small circle of yellow in the snow. And I stood there longer than I needed to, listening, not for bells, for anything, but the town stayed quiet. The house stayed still. Whatever had been decided for me, it wasn't going to explain itself tonight. I stepped inside, closed the door gently behind me, and let the silence have its way, for now. The lights were off when I came back inside, but the house didn't feel asleep. It felt alert, like it had been waiting for me to return, counting the minutes in its own quiet way. I closed the door gently, the latch clicking softer than usual. The sound traveled down the hallway and didn't come back. Even the echo seemed to stop short, as if it knew better. Snow brushed against the windows, slow and not knocking, just reminding. Kavana. I stood there with my coat still on, breathing in the smell of cold air and old wood. The house held it with me, like it remembered winters before this one. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. Just the small lamp by the stairs, the one my wife picked because it made shadows kinder. The hallway stretched out, narrow and familiar. Every mark on the wall had a story I once knew by heart. I walked slowly, my footsteps careful. The floor creaked once beneath my heel, not in complaint, more like recognition. The first room I passed was his. I hadn't been in there in years. The door opened easily. It always had. Dust floated in the lamplight, soft as breath. The room smelled like time, paper, fabric, something faintly sweet and forgotten. His bed was still against the far wall, the blanket folded the way he used to insist it be. Straight lines, corners tucked in tight. I ran my hand along the dresser, leaving a clean streak in the dust. Old trophies sat there, plastic gold dulled by years of quiet. A soccer ball rested beneath the desk, half deflated, patient. Nothing here felt abandoned. It felt paused. I picked up a picture frame from the shelf. My son at 8 years old, front teeth missing, grinning too wide for the camera. My arms slung around his shoulders. I wiped the glass with my sleeve. The smile came into focus. Mine didn't. I set the frame back carefully, like it might shatter if I wasn't gentle. On the hook behind the door, his jacket still hung, blue canvas, faded at the elbows. I pressed my face into it before I could stop myself. It smelled faintly of cedar and cold air. The way he used to smell when he came home after dark. I held it there longer than necessary. The house didn't rush me. In the living room, the couch sagged on the side he always claimed. The indentation never fully bounced back. I sat there for a moment, staring at the blank television screen. I could almost hear him flipping through channels, sighing like nothing was ever good enough. My wife used to say silence was loud in this room. She was right. It wasn't empty. It was full of things that had stopped mid-sentence. I moved into the kitchen last. The heart of the house, the place where conversations used to happen without planning. I turned on the small light above the sink. It hummed softly, uneven, like it might go out at any moment. The table sat exactly where it always had. 4 chairs, too rarely used now. I pulled one out and sat down. The wood was cool through my shirt. Outside, the snow thickened, blurring the edges of the world. Inside, the clock ticked louder than it should have. I thought about the last real conversation we'd had at this table. Not a holiday, not a polite visit, a normal one. I remembered him standing by the counter, arms crossed, listening more than speaking. A look on his face I hadn't recognized at the time. Had he already decided something then? Or had someone helped him decide later? The thought settled heavy in my chest. I stared at the empty chair across from me. The one my son used to rock back on 2 legs, earning sharp looks from his mother. Things said carefully, things said without me. He's distant. He's difficult. He doesn't understand. I wondered whose voice he heard when he thought of me and when it stopped sounding like mine. The light outside faded from gray to blue to nothing at all. I didn't move. The house made small sounds around me, pipes cooling, wood shifting. It felt like the walls were listening, like they knew something I didn't. I rested my hands flat on the table, the grain pressed against my palms, grounding. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I felt edited, like parts of me had been removed from a story without my permission. Yuking. I stood and poured myself a glass of water. The tap rattled once before settling. My reflection in the window startled me. Older than I remembered, smaller somehow. I leaned closer, searching my own face, trying to see what others saw when they spoke about me in my absence. Did I look unapproachable, cold? Or had silence done that work for me? I carried the glass back to the table but didn't drink. Kang just held it, let the cold seep in. The jacket still hung by the door. The picture still smiled from the shelf. Nothing here accused me. Nothing defended me either. The house simply held the truth the way houses do, without commentary, without urgency. Eventually, I turned off the kitchen light. The room disappeared behind me. Kang. In the hallway, I paused once more outside his room. The door stayed open. I didn't step inside again. Capris, neck and ass. Some things felt like they were waiting for the right moment. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step measured. The house followed me up with soft creaks like a memory stretching its legs. At the top, I looked back down the dark hallway. For a moment, it felt like something might speak. It didn't. But as I turned toward the bedroom, one thought stayed with me, quiet, insistent, impossible to shake. Whatever had been said about me, the house knew it, and one day it might decide to tell me too. The snow came before the light. Not loudly, not all at once. And I woke to a dimness that felt heavier than sleep, the kind that presses against your eyes even after they're open. The clock said it was early, but the world outside hadn't agreed yet. Everything beyond the window was white and still, like the night had decided to stay. I lay there a moment longer than usual, listening, no wind, no cars. Just the faint, steady hush of snow finishing its work. By the time I stepped outside, the yard was unrecognizable. The fence line had vanished, the path I always took to the shed was gone. Snow covered everything with the same quiet certainty. It didn't care what had been there before. I pulled my gloves tighter and picked up the shovel. The handle was cold enough to sting. It grounded me. The first push cut a clean line through the white. The sound was soft, almost polite. A steady scrape, then another. I settled into the rhythm quickly. Push, lift, turn. Breath fogged the air in front of me, rising and disappearing like unfinished thoughts. Shoveling has a way of emptying your head, or maybe it just keeps the noise busy. Each movement felt measured, deliberate. I wasn't in a hurry. Snow slid off the blade in slow arcs, landing with dull thuds. The yard began to reappear in pieces. A corner of the porch, the edge of the walk. The base of the old maple tree. That tree had been there longer than any of us. Its branches reached wide bare now, holding snow like memory. I worked toward it without thinking. The cold crept through my gloves, numbing my fingers. I welcomed it. And pain like that asks for attention. It keeps you present. I stopped once to catch my breath, leaning on the shovel. The house behind me stood quiet, watching. No footprints led away from it, no tracks coming back, just mine looping slowly through the yard. When the Shraven summoned struck stare. When the shovel struck something solid, the sound didn't match the snow. It wasn't a scrape, it wasn't a crunch. It was hollow, a dull, contained thud that traveled up the handle and into my arms. I froze. The sound echoed in the quiet longer than it should have. I tapped the spot again, lightly this time. The same hollow answer came back. Not stone, not earth, something else. My first thought was that it had always been there, a buried root. An old piece of scrap, forgotten by time. I told myself that. Still, my hands tightened on the shovel. I brushed snow away with my boot, careful now. The top of something dark emerged beneath the white metal. Rust-colored, I stood there, breath shallow, listening to my own pulse. The snow kept falling, indifferent. I could have left it, covered it back up. Winter is good at keeping secrets. It doesn't ask questions. For a moment I considered it, letting the shovel rest, walking back to the house. The cold pressed harder, like it was waiting for my decision. I thought of the bells, the silence afterward. Kaksa Bakash. I lowered myself to my knees. The snow came away easily, almost eager. Each brush of my glove revealed more of the object's edge, a small box, tin by the look of it. Bent slightly, corners rounded by time, it sat at the base of the maple, tucked close to the roots, deliberate. My breath caught, not with fear but recognition. This hadn't been dropped, it had been placed. I rested my hands on my thighs and stared at it. The snow filled the quiet spaces around us, softening the moment. No wind, no birds. Just me kneeling in the yard like I was waiting for instructions. I thought about how long it had been there. Through summers and falls, through rains and heat, waiting for winter to remember. My gloves were soaked through now. I didn't notice until my fingers began to ache. I reached out and touched the box, cold, solid, real. I pulled it free with both hands. It was heavier than I expected. Something shifted inside, a muted slide that made my stomach tighten. I stood slowly, holding it against my chest like it might fall apart if I didn't. The walk back to the porch felt longer than it should have. Snow clung to my boots, my knees. The house seemed closer with every step, like it was leaning in. I set the box down on the porch rail and brushed snow from the lid. And my glove left a wet smear across the rust. There were no markings, no name, just time. And I didn't open it, not yet. I stood there, listening to the quiet again. It had changed. It felt expectant. As if the yard had done its part and was done watching. I picked up the shovel and leaned it against the wall. The handle knocked softly, a small sound that felt too loud. Inside, the heat wrapped around me too quickly. My fingers burned as they thawed. I set the box on the kitchen table right in the center. Where conversations used to happen, water pooled beneath it, darkening the wood. I stared at the lid. Snow tapped lightly against the window like punctuation. I didn't rush. I made coffee, let it cool. I changed my gloves, rubbed my hands together until the feeling returned. All the while, the box stayed where it was. Patient, whatever was inside had waited long enough. When I finally sat down, the chair creaked like it remembered me. I rested my hands on the table, one on either side of the box. The tin smelled faintly of damp earth and metal, of being hidden. I thought about words. How easily they're buried, how winter has a way of lifting them back to the surface. I hooked my finger under the lid. It resisted just a little, Fiao. I paused. Some truths don't need force. They just need time. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, I took a breath and wondered, not for the first time, what winter had decided I was ready to hear now. The stove hadn't warmed the room yet, but the box was already changing. A thin line of water crept from beneath it, darkening the wood floor like a slow confession. I stood there watching it happen, afraid to touch it again, afraid it might speak before I was ready to listen. The house was quiet in that careful way it gets when something important has crossed the threshold, not asleep, not empty aware. I pulled a chair closer to the stove and set the tin box on it, close enough to feel the heat, not close enough to rush it. The metal clicked softly as it warmed, a sound too small to be accidental, like something waking up. The room smelled faintly of iron and damp paper. Winter still clung to the box, refusing to let go all at once. I poured myself coffee I didn't drink and held the mug until the heat became uncomfortable, then set it down untouched. The box sat there between breaths and bent at the corners, scarred with rust. It looked older than it was. Or maybe age just shows faster when something has been hidden. I told myself not to assume. Boxes don't carry intent, people do. Still, my chest felt tight. I crouched beside the chair and rested my hand lightly on the lid. The metal was no longer biting cold. Just cool, reluctant. My fingers traced the bent edge, the shallow dents, marks left by weather or by hands. I wondered who had placed it beneath the maple, and how many winters it had waited there, listening. The stove ticked softly behind me. The clock in the other room kept time without urgency. I stayed like that longer than necessary, giving myself room to step back. The lid resisted when I lifted it, not locked, just stiff with age. I eased it open slow, like I might scare something. The hinge creaked, a tired sound, then stopped. Inside, everything was dry, folded papers, stacked neatly, wrapped once in a faded cloth I recognized instantly. My wife's old dish towel, blue stripes, threadbare at the edges, my breath caught. I lifted the bundle carefully, like it might crumble. It didn't. The cloth smelled faintly of soap and time. Of kitchens, long quiet. I unfolded it one corner at a time. Paper edges appeared, yellowed but intact. Handwriting peeked through. Before I read a word I knew, I sat down hard in the chair, the box forgotten at my feet. My hands began to shake, small and uncontrollable. I pressed them together until they steadied. The name at the top of the first page confirmed it. My son's, his handwriting hadn't changed much, careful. Camastrid. Even as a boy, he wrote like he was afraid of being misunderstood. The ink had faded slightly, but the pressure of the pen remained, each letter pressed into the paper with intention. I didn't read right away, I just stared. There's a moment when recognition hurts more than truth. This was that moment. I ran my thumb along the margin, feeling the grooves left behind, evidence of hesitation, of pauses mid-thought. The date at the top caught my eye. Years ago, my chest tightened, and I tried to remember that version of time, what I was doing, what I thought we were. The stove clicked again. Somewhere, snow slid off the roof with a soft thump. The world kept moving. I unfolded the letter slowly, like ceremony mattered. The first line was simple, Dad. Just that, no anger, no distance. I swallowed hard. The words that followed were careful, almost apologetic. Questions framed gently, concerns dressed as curiosity. He wrote about confusion, about conversations that left him unsettled. He mentioned things I had never said, decisions I had never made. I felt something shift inside me, not anger, rugigation. I read on. The letter didn't accuse. It wondered. He wrote about being told I was tired, that I needed space, that I didn't want to be involved. Each sentence landed quietly, like snow. I stopped reading and stared at the wall. The room felt smaller now. Closer. Closer. Yeah, this wasn't abandonment, it was translation. Someone had spoken for me. To make the second letter, then the third, then the third. Okay. Each one followed the same careful pattern, more distance, more caution. He wrote about not wanting to upset anyone, about choosing peace over clarity. I knew that instinct. I'd taught it to him without meaning to. Okay, my hands shook again. Not from cold this time. At the bottom of one page, his handwriting grew tighter, smaller. Again, a single line stood apart. I hope you understand. I closed my eyes. I had never been given the chance. I gathered the letters back into the cloth, my movements slower now. The tin box waited on the floor, open, patient. I placed the bundle back inside and closed the lid gently. It shut without protest. The box felt heavier than before, not with weight, with meaning. I carried it to the kitchen table and set it in the center, where conversations were meant to happen. 8. The water beneath it had dried, leaving a faint ring on the wood. A mark. I sat across from it, hands folded. The house was very quiet, not empty. Listening, I thought about the maple tree. The care it must have taken to hide this there. Remit, protected, someone had wanted these letters to survive. But, not to be found too soon, winter had chosen the moment. Or maybe it had simply run out of patience. I didn't open the box again that night. Some truths need space once they arrive. They don't like being rushed. I turned off the stove and let the room cool naturally. The ticking slowed, then stopped. Outside, the snow continued its steady fall. Inside, I sat with the box between us, me and the story I'd been missing, and understood something quietly, painfully clear. Whatever had been said about me, it had been written down too, and Winter had finally decided. I was ready to read it. The lamp on the table cast a small circle of light, just enough to hold the letter steady. Everything beyond it faded into shadow. The house stayed quiet, like it didn't want to interrupt. I sat down slowly, the chair creaking beneath me. Not loud, not complaining, just acknowledging that I was there. That I had come back to this place with something unfinished in my hands. The envelope was thin, soft at the corners, easelled, but not often. I ran my thumb along the edge before opening it, not delaying. Just steadying myself. The paper inside was folded once, neatly, the way he always did things when he was younger. And the date at the top stopped me years ago, a time I remembered clearly, or thought I did. Back then, I still believed we were close, still believed distance was just geography, not something growing quietly between words. I unfolded the letter and let it rest flat on the table. The paper made a soft sound, almost a sigh. His handwriting filled the page, careful, mesmered it, even spacing, straight lines. He had always written like that, as if clarity could prevent pain. Dad. Just that, no greeting, no warmth layered on top, not cold either. Honest. I took a breath before reading further, like the words might push back. He wrote about confusion, about conversations that left him unsettled long after they ended. He didn't name anyone at first. Just someone. I could see him pausing between sentences, lifting the pen, putting it back down. Those pauses lived in the margins. He wrote that he'd been told I was tired, that I needed space, that I had said certain things. I stopped reading. The room felt tighter now, as if the walls had leaned in a little closer. I stared at the sentence, reading it again, then once more. I had never said that. The realization didn't come with anger. It came with something quieter, displacement. I kept reading. He apologized more than once, not for accusing, for asking. I don't want to misunderstand you, he wrote. Rekadamau bedavnau thirdans the sexting concession sika. I just want to know where we stand. The words pressed gently, but firmly. This wasn't defiance. It was doubt learning to speak. I closed my eyes and pictured him writing this, sitting somewhere unfamiliar, and maybe at a borrowed table, trying to sound calm. He mentioned choices I'd supposedly made, decisions about the future, and about involvement, things I had never been consulted on. I felt a strange weight settle in my chest. Not grief, not anger, recognition. This wasn't distance. This was translation gone wrong. Someone had spoken for me, carefully, convincingly. The letter moved slowly toward its end. His tone shifted there, more careful, more restrained. If I've misunderstood, he wrote, I'm sorry. That line sat alone. Again, I swallowed hard. Apologies have weight when they aren't needed. I lowered the paper and looked around the kitchen, at the familiar corners, the small crack in the wall by the sink. This was where he used to sit after school, where conversations happened without planning. You get how many things had been decided elsewhere, while this table stayed empty. The clock ticked once, then again. Each sound felt louder now. I folded the letter carefully and set it beside the tin box. My hand shook slightly as I did. I hadn't realized how much effort it took to stay still until that moment. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling, at the faint water stain near the corner. I remembered how he used to ask questions as a child, how he trusted the answers. When had that changed? I picked the letter back up, read it again, this time slower. Between the lines, I could hear his hesitation. The way he circled the truth instead of stepping into it. He didn't accuse me. He prepared himself for disappointment. That realization landed quietly, but it landed deep. I reached for the next letter. The date was later, months after the first. The tone had shifted, still polite, still careful, but guarded now. He wrote less about confusion, more about acceptance, as if he had already adjusted to a version of me I didn't recognize. Each sentence felt like a door closing softly, not slammed, not locked, just eased shut. I noticed how often he wrote "I understand," even when nothing had been explained. Even when understanding meant giving something up, I wondered who had taught him that lesson. Not his mother, not me. The house made a small sound behind me, a pipe settling, the floor shifting. I didn't turn around. I stayed with the letters, stayed with the realization forming slowly like frost on glass. This wasn't one conversation. It was many, repeated, reinforced, a story told often enough to feel true. I thought back to visits that felt strained, phone calls that ended too soon, the way his voice had changed, careful, neutral. I had blamed time, life. For I hadn't considered narration. I stacked the letters neatly, aligning the edges. They felt heavier together. I rested my hand on top of them and closed my eyes. I wasn't angry at him. That surprised me. I felt something closer to grief, not for what was lost, but for how it had been lost quietly, without consent. I opened my eyes and looked at the tin box again, at the care taken to preserve these words. To protect them, someone hadn't wanted them destroyed, just delayed. That detail stayed with me. This wasn't cruelty. It was control. I slid the letters back into the box, one by one. The lid closed with a soft click. Yukang, I didn't push it away. I left it where it was, in the center of the table, where truth belonged. Outside, the snow had slowed, large flakes drifting lazily now. I stood and walked to the window, pressing my forehead lightly against the cold glass. The yard looked untouched again. Like nothing had happened. I knew better. Words had been placed between us, carefully, taught, repeated, and my son had learned to doubt me before he learned to ask. I stood there a long time, watching the snow settle and wondering who had first planted that doubt, and how many more letters waited in the dark, still ready to be read. And the letters didn't end where I thought they would. They kept going, stacked beneath the first ones, pressed flat by time, patient in their order. I sat at the table with the lamp still on, the light growing warmer as the night leaned in. Outside, the snow had settled into itself. Inside, the years began to move again. I lifted the next letter slowly. Then another. They were dated months apart, sometimes longer. Gaps I hadn't noticed before now felt deliberate, mesmerate. I took a breath and began. At first, the tone barely changed, still polite, still careful. He wrote about being busy. About work, about schedules not lining up, things I remembered hearing, things I'd accepted without question. But now, reading them together, I noticed what wasn't there. No warmth, no ease, just updates. Like someone reporting from a distance already agreed upon. I remembered missed calls, how I'd tell myself he was just busy. I remembered short visits, hugs that ended too soon, smiles that didn't stay long enough to reach the eyes. At the time, I blamed life. That's what you do when you don't want to ask harder questions. Now the letters filled in the silence, not with accusations, with framing. In one letter, he mentioned a conversation he'd had recently. He didn't say with whom. They said you didn't like talking on the phone, he wrote, that it made you uncomfortable. I stared at that line. I loved talking to him, even when I didn't know what to say, especially then. I read the sentence again, slower this time. The words didn't change. Another letter mentioned a holiday I'd barely remembered. He wrote that he hadn't wanted to put pressure on me to attend pressure. Words sat heavy. I had waited by the phone that day, checked it more times than I'd admit. I remembered telling myself I must have misunderstood the plan. Someone else had explained it for me. The house creaked softly as I shifted in my chair. It sounded like it was stretching, making room for the truth. I laid the letters out across the table in order, a quiet timeline. There it was. Vistance didn't appear suddenly. And it was introduced, repeated, confirmant, a steady shaping of absence. I thought about the way his voice changed over the years. And more formal, more careful, how he stopped asking certain questions, how he stopped filling silences. That hadn't been his nature. It had been taught. One letter stood out, shorter than the rest. He wrote about stopping by town but not calling. He said he didn't want to make things awkward. I remembered that day I'd seen his car turn down the wrong street, told myself I was mistaken, I hadn't been. He'd been told I didn't want surprises. I pressed my fingers flat against the table, grounding myself. Again, the wood felt solid, unmoving, the conversations that never happened because someone else was afraid of what they might sound like. Keck and I stood and turned off the lamp. The room fell into shadow, softened by moonlight through the window. The box remained visible, a dark shape against the table. I realized then that this story wasn't finished shaping itself. It had simply reached the point where silence could no longer carry it. As I walked toward the hallway, one question stayed with me, gentle, persistent, unresolved. If this was built to keep the peace, what would happen when someone finally chose honesty instead? The morning arrived clean and bright, like it was trying to start over without asking permission. Snow covered the sidewalks in a smooth, unbroken layer. No footprints yet, no stories written into it. I stood at the door longer than usual, coat folded over my arm, letters pressed flat in the pocket. They rested there like something warm or something waiting. When I stepped outside, the cold took me by the face. Sharp, honest, the kind that doesn't pretend to be gentle. The street looked familiar in a way that felt distant, as if I were seeing it through glass. The bakery window glowed softly. That the post office flag hung stiff and unmoving, the same town I'd walked through 1,000 times. Only now everything felt outlined, exposed by the snow. Each step made a sound. A quiet crunch that followed me like a thought I couldn't set down. I didn't plan the walk. My feet knew where to go, past the corner where the hardware store used to be, and past the bench where my son and I once shared a sandwich in the summer. I wondered if the town remembered that, or if memory belonged only to those who kept walking forward. The first face I saw was Mrs. Halverson from 3 doors down. She paused mid-step when she noticed me. Oh, she said, just that. Her smile arrived late, didn't quite fit. How are you, she asked. I nodded. I'm all right. She didn't ask anything else. Some questions already have answers people don't want to hear. Further down, 2 men stood outside the bank, hands in pockets, breath clouding the air. One of them waved. The other looked away. Guilt doesn't always lower its eyes. Sometimes it pretends not to notice at all. The letters shifted in my coat as I walked, a reminder, not heavy, just present. I felt no urge to pull them out. This wasn't about proof, it was about listening. The cafe door chimed when I stepped inside, a small, bright sound that cut through the low murmur of voices. Conversations didn't stop, it hesitated, like someone holding their breath too long. The smell of coffee and toast wrapped around me, familiar, comforting, almost enough to make me forget why I was there. I took my usual table by the window. The one with the loose leg that wobbles if you lean too far forward. The floor creaked under my weight. It sounded like recognition. The waitress came over with her pad already in hand. She smiled the way people do when they're trying not to show something else. Same as always? She asked. Yes, I said. She didn't write it down. I watched the room while I waited. 2 women whispered near the counter. A man stirred his coffee too long, eyes fixed on the surface like it might say something back. Someone laughed. Too loud. Peace can be loud when it's being protected. My coffee arrived. Steam rose slowly, twisting into the air. I wrapped my hands around the mug and let the warmth sink in. I didn't speak, I listened. At the table behind me, a voice said my name, not loudly, more like testing it. Again, another voice answered, Abdur Sufterbrer, softer. She's here. As if I might not be real. No one came over. No one asked me anything they didn't need to. Silence does most of the work. I thought about how often I'd sat in this room before, unaware of the stories being shaped in corners. The concern shared over half-finished cups, the gentle warnings disguised as care. I wondered how many times my absence had made those conversations easier. The waitress refilled my cup without asking. Her hand shook just slightly. She didn't look at me. I finished my coffee slowly, each sip measured. And when I stood, chairs scraped a little too loudly. Eyes followed me, then looked away. Snowlight flooded through the window behind me, sharp and unforgiving. Nothing stays hidden in that kind of light. And outside again, the cold felt different, less like an enemy, more like a witness. Someone had been filling his quiet with explanations, carefully, not cruelly, just consistently. The kind of voice that sounds reasonable when you're young, when you want peace more than clarity. I realized then that my absence hadn't been accidental, it had been curated, trimmed, softened, made to look like choice. The thought didn't arrive with anger, it arrived with a strange calm. Things make sense when you finally see the pattern. I picked up a letter dated 2 years after the first. The language had changed. He no longer asked questions. He stated assumptions. You probably don't want to come, he wrote. I understand that line again. I closed my eyes. Understanding had replaced truth. I remember Curtis during visits, the way he'd ask about the weather, about work. Welk. Never about us. I had mistaken restraint for maturity. It had been caution. The letters showed me the years I'd lost without realizing it, not stolen violently, redacted. I wondered how many times he'd been told, your father doesn't mean it that way, he's just like that. Those phrases shape people quietly. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. The light flickered once, then steadied. I wasn't angry at the person who did this, not yet. And I was too busy grieving the conversations that never happened, the ones replaced by interpretation. I thought about how often I'd said nothing to avoid conflict, how often I'd trusted others to understand me without explanation. That silence had been useful to someone. I could see that now the final letter in the stack felt heavier. Not because of what it said, but because of what it accepted. He wrote about distance like it was weather. Unchangeable. He wrote about me like I was a fixed shape, already defined. I folded it slowly. My hands were steady now. I gathered the letters back into a neat stack, out of the edges. Hurricane. The tin box waited nearby, open, familiar now. I placed the letters inside, but didn't close the lid. Some things shouldn't be sealed again. Outside, the snow had stopped completely. The night felt open. Kang. I walked to the window and looked out at the yard. The maple tree stood dark against the white. And that's where the box had waited, where the story had paused. I understood now why. Someone needed me gone for this story to work. Not erased, just distant enough not to contradict it. I stood there a long time, breathing slowly, watching my reflection faintly in the glass. I wasn't invisible, and I'd just been written out behind me. The letters rested in the open box, quiet but undeniable. And as the house settled into its nighttime sounds, one question stayed with me, steady, insistent, impossible to ignore. Who had benefited most from my silence? And what else had they been careful to say, while I wasn't there to speak for myself? The room felt quieter than before, not empty, attentive. The letters were spread out again, but this time I wasn't reading for dates, I was reading for names. The lamp hummed softly, the kind of sound you only notice when everything else is stopped. I picked up the next letter and felt it before I understood it. The weight had changed, the tone too. Something had entered the room with us. The name appeared halfway down the page, casual, almost kind, a family friend. Someone I'd trusted without thinking. He mentioned them as if they were weather, present, unavoidable, neutral. They were worried, he wrote. They just wanted to make sure everything was okay. I paused there. Concern wears many faces. Some of them practice smiling. Another letter followed, dated months later. This time a relative, someone who'd held my hand once at a funeral. Someone who'd told me they understood. The tone shifted again, more careful now. As if the pen itself was listening, they said you seemed distant, he wrote, that you might be angry. The word felt misplaced, like furniture moved without asking. I leaned back in my chair and let the letter rest on my chest. The paper rose and fell with my breath. I remembered conversations with these people, how they'd asked gentle questions, how I'd answered honestly, or thought I had. The letters began to read differently now, not as thoughts, but as echoes. Each one carried the shape of another voice, filtered, softened, and truth diluted until it could pass as concern. I noticed the phrasing, they feel, they think. They were just trying to help, no accusations, just suggestions, the most dangerous kind. In one letter, he wrote slower. I could tell the sentences were shorter, the spaces wider. They don't want us to fight, he wrote. They're just worried this could get worse. Worse than what? Silence has a way of inventing answers when none are offered. I thought about how peace is often used as a shield, how it's held up to avoid saying the wrong thing or the right one. Someone had taught him that confrontation meant damage, that questions were threats. that keeping things smooth mattered more than keeping them true. Okay. I traced a finger under a sentence where the ink pressed harder. He'd hesitated there. Okay. I don't want to hurt anyone, he wrote. Anyone. The word didn't include me. Not anymore. I remembered moments now sharpened by this knowledge, how visits felt supervised, how conversations stayed shallow, how certain topics never came up, as if they'd already been decided elsewhere. He hadn't been distant. He'd been careful. Another name appeared, this one unexpected, someone I'd defended once, someone I'd trusted with context. The letter grew cautious around them. They're afraid you'll react badly, he wrote. React. As if honesty were violence, the grief arrived quietly, not loud enough to announce itself, and just enough to settle in my chest. I wasn't mourning lost years, Kanenseka. I was mourning the version of me he'd been taught to believe in, a sharper one, a colder one. Someone I didn't recognize. I folded that letter and set it aside. The floor creaked when I stood. It sounded like it remembered something I didn't. I walked to the sink and rinsed my hands, even though they weren't dirty. The water ran clear, cold. I watched it spill over my fingers and disappear. Back at the table, I kept reading. The pattern held. Concern became warning, warning became assumption, all wrapped in the language of love. One letter ended abruptly, no closing. And just a sentence that stopped mid-thought. I just want everyone to be okay. I imagined him pausing there, listening, waiting for approval before continuing. That was when I understood these letters weren't written alone. They were shaped in rooms where I wasn't present, in conversations where my absence made things easier, where my silence could be translated however it suited the peace being protected. I thought about how often I'd been told. They mean, well, how that phrase smooths over so much. Intent doesn't erase impact, but it excuses it. The realization didn't come with anger. It came with a tired kind of clarity. Truth hadn't been replaced with lies. It had been softened until it lost its edges, until it could be held without discomfort. I gathered the letters with names and placed them in a separate stack. This pile felt heavier, not because of blame, but because of proximity. These weren't strangers, these were people who knew me or thought they did. I wondered how many times he'd considered calling me, how many times he'd chosen, not out of cruelty, out of fear of upsetting the balance someone else had arranged. The house shifted around me as the night deepened. A car passed outside. Its headlights brushed the wall and moved on to temporary illumination, then darkness again. I held the last letter of the stack. The paper was worn thinner than the others. Read more times. He wrote about distance like it was irreversible, about peace like it was fragile glass. I hope you understand. He ended. I did too well. I sat there long after the letters were returned to the box. The lid stayed open. Some things need air. And I wasn't angry at the names between the lines. Not yet. I was grieving the space where truth should have lived. I walked past the cafe and kept going. Toward the square, a familiar face stepped out from the florist's shop. A woman I'd trusted once. Someone whose name appeared in one of the letters. She stopped when she saw me. We stood there, snow between us, untouched. I was meaning to call, she said. I waited. She didn't continue. I've been busy, she added. Finally, I nodded. Busyness is a useful shield. So is time. I hope you know, she said, eyes fixed on the ground. We only wanted what was best. Best. The sentence hung there unfinished. Best for whom? I know, I said. It was true. She looked relieved. Relief can be heavier than guilt. She reached out like she might touch my arm, then stopped herself. I'm glad you're well, she said. What, church, you're well, she said. I smiled, not with my eyes. The square was empty. Snow piled high around the statue at its center. Someone had cleared a narrow path through it, a careful effort. I followed it step by step. I thought about what would happen if I spoke, if I opened my coat and let the letters fall into the light, if I said the names out loud. And the town would listen. Of that I was sure, but listening doesn't always lead to understanding. Sometimes it just rearranges the silence. I reached the edge of the square and stopped. The wind moved through the trees, shaking loose a dusting of snow. It fell softly, settling back where it came from. I touched the pocket where the letters waited. Not yet. Some truths need the right moment, and some moments need more quiet before they can hold the weight of words. I turned back toward home. Footprints now marked the path behind me. Proof I'd been here, seen. The town continued on, careful, polite, unchanged. Careful. The town continued on, careful, polite, unchanged. For now. As I walked, one thought stayed with me, steady as my breath. I hadn't spoken yet, but I was no longer silent, and when the time came to open my mouth, Who, I wondered, would finally be ready to listen? The house smelled faintly of smoke and cold wood. I had returned from the walk through town, snow melting off my coat onto the floorboards. Crick. The letters waited on the table like patient shadows. The letters waited on the table like patient shadows. One more remained. One I hadn't seen before. I picked it up slowly. The envelope was soft, worn at the edges. His handwriting curved across the front, hesitant but unmistakable. It was addressed to me, not anyone else. Okay? Not the friends or relatives who had shaped his silence. Okay. I sat by the window, the night outside deep and still. The snow had settled quiet and heavy, muffling the distant sounds of the town. I broke the seal carefully, as if the paper might shatter beneath my fingers. Inside, the words waited, patient and tremulous. He began with the wedding. The words were cautious, weighed down with hesitation. I wanted you there, he wrote, but the sentence twisted. I was told it would cause harm. The letters I had read before were careful. This one was trembling, unpracticed, almost alive in its honesty. I traced the letters with my fingertip, reading and rereading. He described confusion I had never imagined. He admitted fear. Fear of upsetting the delicate balance someone else had built around him. Fear of speaking for himself. Fear that including me might fracture the fragile peace. I felt the room press in closer. The shadows leaned near the lamp's soft glow. I could almost hear his pause between each word. The silence around me seemed to echo his. He wrote of wanting me there, not as a guest, not as a symbol, but as his mother, the person who had once held him, taught him, laughed with him. But the sentence stopped. The next line was blank. He didn't finish. The courage ran out mid-thought. I put the letter down, let the words breathe around me. The paper felt heavier than the snow outside. Was this silence ever meant to last? I remembered that morning of the wedding, the house empty, cankened, the town alive without me, the bells faint and late. I had assumed absence was my own. But here it was, confessed, it had been guided, shaped, managed. His words pulled the past closer. Every smile, every polite word, every missed call, all reflected back differently now. Not neglect, not distance. A hesitation taught, a caution learned. I picked the letter back up. The edges curled slightly in the warmth of my hands. Each word felt like a confession, an apology without sound. He didn't ask for forgiveness, he simply explained or tried to. I could feel the pauses, the breaks between sentences were as meaningful as the writing. I wanted you there. I was told it would cause harm, and then silence. The kind of silence that makes the floorboards groan and the walls lean in. And the kind that waits for someone to respond. I walked through the kitchen. The table where we once ate breakfast together loomed empty. The lamp threw a pool of light across the letters. I set the envelope there again, letting it rest among its companions. It belonged there now. Among truths partially spoken and words half-formed, I sank into the chair. Outside, the wind whispered against the eaves. A loose shutter banged softly. The house was awake with the memory of winter and absence. I read the letter again, letting the sentences flow through me instead of past me. I wanted you there. Repeated in my mind like a quiet refrain. The phrasing fragile, almost afraid to exist. It was more than a note. It was a door, left ajar, leading to a place I hadn't been allowed to enter. I imagined him sitting somewhere else, pen in hand, hesitating, checking the floor, the walls, the weight of the air. Writing and erasing, trying to balance his love for me against the instructions he had received. Against a fear he did not fully understand. The courage that abandoned him mid-sentence now belonged to me. I held it in my hands, felt its weight, its unfinished edges cutting softly into my thoughts. Time passed differently then, minutes stretched into hours. The snow outside became a mirror of the quiet inside. My hands relaxed around the paper. I no longer felt the need to rush through the story. It was enough to sit, to breathe, to witness. The room smelled faintly of coffee I had forgotten to make. The floor creaked in memory, reminding me that nothing remained exactly as it had been. And yet, in this small lamplit corner, the world felt suspended. I folded the letter carefully, leaving the crease soft. Set it next to the tin box that had revealed so many things already. I didn't reach for explanations. I didn't demand clarity. I allowed the words to exist as they were, part confession, part hesitation, part love. Outside, the night deepened. The wind carried small echoes of movement through the empty streets. I imagined the snow reflecting the light of a morning yet to come. Everything covered, softened, waiting for clarity. I remained in the chair, letting the letter rest in its place. The weight of what had been unsent, unread, unfinished, filled the space, not with anger, not with bitterness. Yeah, but with quiet acknowledgment, the house breathed around me, walls held the warmth of winter and the chill of absence. The lamp flickered once, a shadow passed across the floor, and I knew that tonight the story had not ended. King. The silence wasn't permanent and I Tubintain. The silence wasn't permanent, it had simply been paused, and I sat with the unsent truth. Patient, unfinished, waiting for a time when courage might return, when words could finally meet ears that wanted to hear. The night closed in, still and soft. I left the lamp on, the letters on the table. Yet the envelope fragile, unopened in the glow of understanding. Outside, snow fell in silence. And for the first time, I felt the quiet hold something more than absence. I felt it hold possibility. The question remained, gentle and persistent. When silence finally ends, what will we do with the truth? The morning was still, snow lingered in corners where the plow hadn't reached, soft mounds catching the weak sunlight. Icicles hung from the eaves like thin glass, catching light and bending it into quiet rainbows across the porch. I held the phone in my hand longer than I needed to, feeling its weight, feeling the memory of every unanswered call before it. The house seemed to breathe with me, listening, waiting. I paced slowly by the window, watching the street glisten under the thawing sun. Footsteps crunched in the distance, neighbors cautious, familiar, passing without noticing me. Inside, the tin box sat on the table, letters stacked like old ghosts. I ran my fingers over them one last time, tracing the folds, the edges, the ink that had faded but never forgotten. I thought about the winter that brought them back to me, the snow that revealed what had been buried. A hesitation rose like smoke in my chest. Could a call undo years of silence? Or would it only make the quiet heavier? I dialed his number slowly, each digit deliberate. As if time itself had slowed to watch me, the line rang. Rang, then a click. His voice came through, older than I remembered, edged with distance, tempered by years of careful living. Hello? I swallowed the lump in my throat. Hi, I said, simple, fragile. There was a pause, a listening pause, then it's good to hear you. Even through the line, I felt the weight of that pause, the years pressed into it. We didn't rush. We circled the truth like deer on frozen fields, careful not to break the ice beneath our feet. I told him at the furfbach for first. How the shovel had struck metal beneath the maple tree, how winter had returned what was lost, how I carried it inside, letting it thaw, letting it breathe again. Then the letters, each one a fragment of memory and misunderstanding. I told him how his handwriting had trembled on the paper, how courage had run out mid-sentence, and how the last letter had ended with a silence that mirrored my own. And there was another pause. I could hear the breath between his words. I could hear him catching himself. Hearing me, listening fully for the first time in years. I can't. He started, and the line hesitated. I didn't. And then nothing. The silence was not empty. It carried everything we hadn't said. All the absences, the curated distance, the explanations whispered in hallways when I wasn't present. The quiet between us was thick, almost solid. I imagined the pause stretching across the years, folding us back together in a space that had waited for this moment. I told him I understood, not fully, not perfectly, but enough to begin. And I spoke softly, letting the words fall into the rhythm of the room, into the snowlight still lingering in the corners of my home. The letters had taught me patience, the winter had taught me endurance, and now the voice at the other end of the line carried the memory of all that had been unsaid. He spoke finally, haltingly. I didn't know what to say. I was told. Another pause, another catch of breath. I thought I was protecting you, he admitted. His words hung in the line like icicles, sharp and fragile. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. I didn't correct him. Not yet. I let him speak the truth as he understood it, letting it fill the empty spaces between us. We spoke carefully, circling the edges of the wedding, of absence, of the quiet that had built between us like walls. I told him about my mornings, repairing the porch, listening to the distant bells, watching snow fall like a curtain over the town. He listened. The words traveled the line slowly, deliberately, echoing years of unspoken thought. At one point, he laughed softly, but it was wet with memory and regret, not a real laugh. A laughter that acknowledges something lost but not entirely gone. I realized then that the letters had done their work. Not by revealing blame, not by proving absence, but by making space. Space for him to hear, for me to speak, for the silence, to finally have room to stretch and breathe. I wanted you there, he said at last. I should have. I don't know why I didn't. Teensy, no accusation. No accusation. No anger. Just the sound of a son finding his words after years of instruction to stay silent. Game. I closed my eyes and let the warmth of the winter sun wash over my hands, still holding the phone. I could hear the slow exhale on his end. The line trembled with it. Come. We spoke for hours or maybe minutes. Time felt suspended. Every pause, every hesitation, every half-finished thought was a gift. The letters had paved a path, and now we walked it together. And though I didn't know what would come after, I felt the quiet certainty that something had shifted. Something real, delicate, and finally ours. When I finally set the phone down, the house was quiet in a different way. Not empty, full of potential. The tin box sat on the table, letters beneath its lid, waiting for the next step. The snow outside had begun to melt more quickly, dripping from the eaves, revealing the street again slowly. I touched the envelope of the final letter. It no longer felt heavy, it felt like a bridge. And I looked out the window at the thinning snow. And for the first time in a long while, I wondered, when silence ends and truth is finally free, what will we do with what remains? The wind stirred the last flake on the porch. I watched it fall, soft and certain, and I knew some stories like winter are patient enough to wait. I endure oat. But when the thaw comes, everything can change. The first warmth of spring seeped through the frost, still clinging to the windowsills. Birdsong hesitated in the garden, cautious after winter's long silence. I heard the creak of the front gate before I saw him, my son standing in the doorway, hands stuffed in his pockets, eyes tracing the familiar lines of the house like it might have changed while I wasn't looking. He didn't smile at first. He just stood, hesitant, the snow-tinged mud clinging to his boots, a guest in his own home. I watched him from the kitchen, fingers brushing the edge of the tin box still resting on the shelf. Its lid was open now, the letters inside no longer felt like secrets. Their paper smelled faintly of cedar and time. I thought about all the winters that had passed before they were unearthed, all the conversations left unspoken, and all the small silences that had felt like walls between us. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful distance he carried like a coat too heavy for the sun. Spring doesn't erase winter. It only makes it easier to notice the edges of what remains. I called softly, "Come in." He nodded, stepping inside, leaving muddy footprints behind. We didn't shake hands, didn't hug. Not yet. We were still learning how to exist in the same space after years of absence. I led him to the living room, the letters resting between us on the coffee table like quiet witnesses. The house held its breath, aware of what had been hidden and what could finally speak. We sat across from each other, the distance measured but no longer insurmountable. I gestured to the tin box. "It stayed with me all winter," I said. He leaned forward, curiosity softening the edges of his cautious stance. His fingers hovered over the letters without touching them, afraid maybe of stirring ghosts. I didn't know it was here," he whispered, and I believed him. I had believed in his absence for so long that the confirmation of his presence felt fragile. We opened the letters together, one at a time, tracing the lines of his handwriting that had once seemed so distant, so achingly familiar. And we didn't rush. Each folded sheet became a conversation. Each pause a shared memory of what had been lost and what we had both survived. The room filled with the quiet sound of pages turning, and for the first time, the silence was not heavy. It was intentional, patient, expectant. I remembered the winters, the snow, the tin box buried under the old maple tree. I remembered the letters that had whispered truths back to me slowly, carefully, like a river cutting through ice. Now we were on the other side. He looked at me, eyes meeting mine, unguarded for a fraction of a second. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low. Not an apology for absence alone, but for all the walls built between us, for the curated distance, for the stories he had been told that made me the stranger. I didn't answer immediately. I didn't need to. The letters spoke for both of us. We were acknowledging what had been, without needing to fix it all at once. Spring had melted more than snow. It had softened the edges of our silence. I gestured to the shelf where the tin box had rested. "It's not hidden anymore," I said. He nodded, understanding. Some things can't be repaired. Some wounds remain tender, delicate, but naming them is the first step toward moving forward. We were not erasing the past, only refusing to let it remain buried. We sat together in the light filtering through the curtains, the room warm despite the chill of the season outside. Every so often he glanced at the letters and I saw the recognition, the grief, and the tentative hope passing across his face. I thought about all the winters, the unanswered questions, the silence that had stretched for years. And now that silence was filled with possibility instead of absence. We didn't rush into conversation, and we didn't pretend that the last years could be rewritten. Instead, we simply existed in the same room, breathing the same air, sharing a space that had once been divided by misunderstandings and carefully curated distance. It felt fragile, like ice under the spring sun, but promising. I reached for a letter, and he mirrored me. We folded the papers together, not hurriedly, not ceremoniously, just carefully, as if each fold could honor the moments they contained. I didn't want to lose you, he admitted quietly, almost to himself. And I understood that words like these take time to form, to find courage. Cact. We let them hang between us, unspoken fully, yet fully acknowledged. The house creaked softly, as if remembering the winters past, the snow that fell over secrets, the walls that had held our absence. Outside, the garden began to awaken. Tiny green shoots pushed through the softened earth, tentative but persistent. I glanced at the tin box. Its contents no longer secret, no longer a burden, no longer a thing that belonged solely to the past. It belonged to us now, to the present, to the work of understanding and connection. We sat a long time after, watching the day stretch its light across the walls, watching the shadows shrink and lengthen as the sun moved. We didn't have all the answers, we didn't try to fix everything, but we had begun the work of naming, of acknowledging, of standing in the same space without the weight of buried truths pressing on our shoulders. Finally he stood, adjusting the collar of his coat. I should go, he said, though neither of us felt ready to part. I know, I replied. But there was no urgency. The acknowledgement itself was enough for now. I watched him go down the path, boots leaving tracks in the softening earth, the tin box resting on the shelf behind me. Spring light touched the walls, the letters, the floor. The house no longer felt heavy. It felt patient, ready, waiting for the next step. And in that quiet, we asked the only question that mattered, unspoken but understood, right? How do we move forward now that nothing is buried? The wind stirred the curtains, lifting them like a gentle breath. Outside, the garden waited. Inside, we waited. And for the first time in years, it felt possible.